There has been a lot of discussion lately around the idea that a war-driven oil shock could push the United States toward a recession while simultaneously bursting multiple major asset bubbles, and it's understandable why this topic is gaining attention, because on the surface it sounds serious and even a bit alarming, but instead of reacting emotionally to headlines, the goal here is to slow things down and look at what is actually happening beneath the surface. By the end of this breakdown, you should feel more grounded, more informed, and better equipped to understand the real risks without getting pulled into exaggerated narratives that don't fully match the data. The common version of this story is simple and easy to follow. Oil prices rise sharply, which increases costs across the economy. Consumers start to feel the pressure and begin to cut back. As spending slows, businesses start to feel the impact, which then spills into the credit system. At the same time, higher borrowing costs weigh on housing, causing demand to weaken. Stocks, which were already priced for strong performance, begin to fall as expectations adjust. Eventually, what looked like a stable economy transitions into something much weaker. It's a clean chain of events, and because it's so clean, it sounds convincing. But clean narratives are not always accurate representations of complex systems. Now, to be fair, parts of this concern are based on real conditions. Oil prices have indeed moved higher, and fuel costs are affecting both households and businesses. Economic growth has slowed compared to previous periods, and savings levels are not as strong as they once were. Debt levels remain elevated across multiple sectors, and borrowing costs, especially mortgage rates, are still relatively high. When you combine all of these factors, it's clear that the system is under pressure, that pressure is real, and it should not be dismissed or ignored. However, where the narrative starts to lose accuracy is when that pressure is immediately interpreted as a guaranteed collapse. There is a critical difference between an economy experiencing strain and one that is breaking apart. Stress can build over time without leading to an immediate crisis, and assuming that every sign of weakness leads directly to a crash can result in poor judgment. This is one of the most common mistakes people make when analyzing markets, confusing early warning signs with final outcomes, understanding that distinction is essential if you want to stay balanced in uncertain conditions. So instead of jumping to conclusions, it makes more sense to examine each part of the system individually and see what the data actually shows. Some areas are clearly under pressure, while others are holding up better than expected. The situation is not black and white, it's layered, uneven, and evolving, and that's exactly why it requires a more careful and structured analysis rather than a single dramatic conclusion. Let's start by looking more closely at housing, because this is one of the areas people often point to when they talk about a potential collapse. There is no question that housing is under pressure right now. Mortgage rates remain elevated compared to the ultra-low levels seen in previous years, and that has significantly reduced affordability for new buyers. Monthly payments are much higher, even if home prices haven't surged dramatically. At the same time, many existing homeowners are locked into lower mortgage rates and are reluctant to sell, which reduces supply. The result is a market that feels stuck. Transactions are slower, and activity is uneven across regions. But it's important to be precise here. Slow and strained is not the same as collapsing. Broad national data still shows that prices, while not booming, have not fallen apart either. That distinction matters. A more accurate way to describe the housing market right now is that it is dealing with friction. Buyers are hesitant because costs are high, and sellers are hesitant because moving would mean taking on a more expensive loan. Builders are still trying to meet demand, but financing conditions make expansion more difficult. On top of that, additional costs like insurance and property taxes in certain areas are adding to the burden of ownership. All of this creates a market that feels heavy and slow-moving. But again, this is not the same as a sudden breakdown. Markets can remain in this kind of constrained state for longer than people expect, especially when supply remains limited and demand, while weaker, does not disappear entirely. Now, the more critical question is not just what housing looks like today, but what could push it further. That brings us to the consumer, because housing ultimately depends on the financial strength of households. Right now, consumers are dealing with multiple pressures at once. Fuel costs have risen, borrowing costs remain high, and savings buffers are thinner than they were before. At the same time, debt levels, especially credit cards and auto loans, are still elevated. This combination does not mean consumers are collapsing, but it does mean they have less flexibility than before. In a stronger environment, households can absorb shocks more easily. In the current environment, each additional cost increase matters more. The labor market adds another layer to this picture. Employment has not collapsed, which is important because income stability supports spending. However, the labor market is not as strong as it once was either. Participation rates are still not fully recovered, and overall momentum has slowed compared to earlier periods. So what you end up with is a situation where people are still working and still spending, but they are doing so with less margin for error. It's not a breakdown, it's a more fragile balance, and in that kind of environment, external shocks, like rising energy costs, can have a bigger impact than they would during stronger economic periods. This is exactly why oil prices are such a key part of the conversation. Energy costs don't just affect one area, they ripple through the entire economy. They influence transportation, production, food prices, and overall business expenses. For consumers, higher fuel costs reduce disposable income. For businesses, they compress margins. If the increase is temporary, the system can adjust. But if it lasts longer, it begins to change behavior. Spending patterns shift, confidence weakens, and decision-making becomes more cautious. That's when a short-term issue can evolve into something more persistent. Now let's shift to the area that probably deserves